LiSTNR production.
A warning. This episode contains references to suicide and domestic violence. If this content affects you, the number for Lifeline is 13 11 14. G'day, I'm former police officer Brent Sanders. And for the past 25 years, I've dedicated myself to sharing what I've learnt on the force to the Australian public so they can better protect themselves from falling victim to crime. So with the help of some of the most respected current and former detectives and high-ranking law enforcement agents, we're going to pull back the curtain on what life is like on the force and what they've learned about how crime and criminals really work. These are real stories from real detectives. This week, the tangible impact of general duties policing and the dangers of online criminal activity.
You have this moment where you're going, is this actually real? Am I potentially going to have to take someone's life today?
Yasmin London is a 13-year veteran of the New South Wales Police Force. Her career coincides with the rapid rise of social media in the 2010s. As others turned a blind eye, Yasmin proactively advocated for children who were paying the price for the general naivety to the hidden risks of the internet.
We were confronted not with an adult, but with a 14-year-old girl over a cyberbullying incident.
To start, we're heading back to Sydney's Newtown in 2006 and to a situation early in her career.
We were on a day shift. It was in the afternoon, looking towards the end of the shift and hoping nothing massive was going to happen. Of course, we said the dreaded Q word, which is, basically illegal in police speak, but the word quiet. And then all of a sudden, VKG goes off with an urgent job down in Erskineville. And so we jumped in the truck, lights and sirens, down to this location, and we entered a house which, had been utterly destroyed. Broken television with a foot that had been through it, cutlery everywhere, drawers pulled out, beds thrown, all over the room. And we were met with a young man. He was probably in his mid-30s, who was suffering from some kind of significant mental illness or mental episode. He had said that he had taken ice. He'd been on an ice bender for a couple of days, and obviously having a mental illness, he wasn't in a great space. So, we came in, tried to talk to him. He became pretty aggressive and he ran out the corridor of this apartment. He grabbed me by the chest and flung me into the side of a wall. And it was one of those moments where you really recognise the power and strength that comes from people taking these sorts of substances. But he ran out and we sort of went on foot, chased him all the way down King Street, essentially down to Camperdown, which is a pretty long pursuit in the end. We had to be pretty fit at that point in time. We lost him for a period of time and, on foot we were looking throughout Camperdown to try and find him. We had other cars looking and we ended up finding him in an abandoned church. And in that moment, when we walked into the church, not expecting him to be there at the time, it was really dark, pitch black darkness essentially in the afternoon. And you have that moment where you're not sure what you're going to find on the other side of that and what that might look like. And I remember the fear in that moment for me was a lot. It was a lot to try and calm my breathing, to sort of get my head right. And we walked in, we were searching for him. My partner told me to draw my gun. And sure enough, a couple of minutes into our search, I saw the glint of a 30-centimetre kitchen knife ahead of me. And it was him, and he was still very agitated. And I remember looking at that kitchen knife because he was doing figure eights with it. And I wasn't sure in that moment, like you have this moment where you're going, is this actually real? Am I potentially going to have to take someone's life today? They teach you, in the police academy that this moment might come. For some it happens, for some you have a 30-year career in it and it never occurs. And it was lucky that day I didn't have to. My partner being, a lot more experienced than me, sort of talked me through it. But I did have to cover this guy for a couple of minutes while my partner walked up to him and spoke to him, calmed him down, got him to put the knife down, and we handcuffed him and got him to the ground. But it was a pretty intense situation really early on in my policing career. And we got back to the station that afternoon. We'd finished a couple of hours later. We had to schedule this gentleman. And I remember reflecting and sort of saying this off the cuff, sort of semi-serious remark, but trying to act cool at the time to my partner, and said, wow, that was pretty intense. Is that usual? And he kind of went to me, mate, that's the job. Take a can of Harden Up and get on with it.
You're 6 weeks in, you're a probationary constable. All the training in the world, it goes out the window as soon as you step into that church, and those fear levels come up and everything else. And all of a sudden you're just yourself. You don't see yourself as a police officer 6 weeks in. You got the uniform on and all the rest, but suddenly you're there, you've got a police issue firearm in your hand. And that moment of actually pointing a firearm at somebody, and there are many police who, as you rightly say, were 20, 30, 40 year service, never had to do it. You're doing it 6 weeks in. When you look back over that, how does that play out in your mind? That whole prospect of pulling that trigger, that applying a little bit of pressure with that index finger, and suddenly that person's dead, and all the ramifications that go with that. And these are heartbeat decisions.
Yeah, it is full on. There's no other way of really describing it, because the weight of responsibility in that moment is something that I don't think many members of the public really respect or recognise is a daily risk for you as a police officer. Holding out a loaded firearm, we're not used to that. In the police academy, you have, maybe 2 or 3 goes with real bullets at the shooting range. Most of the time you're firing blanks, these little plastic blue bullets that are in the magazine. So it's the weight of that. It is, as you say, the trigger. I just squeeze on that, and in the pull of a finger, someone's life potentially is gone. And you've also got to consider, do I have the right? You're going through the legislation in your head, and, your code of conduct and the rules around when you can pull a firearm out, what's an expected situation. This ticked every box. We were looking at a situation where a man was either, imminently or immediately going to take a life or hurt himself. So you think about that. If I had to fire, could I be held criminally responsible? And then the ultimate is taking someone's life away, regardless of what had happened. And in this situation, this was a man who had, yes, taken some illicit substances, but was suffering a mental illness. And that's a no-win situation. Nobody wants that to go wrong. In many ways, he couldn't help the situation that he was in, yet, we were looking at a situation where he might have lost his life. And for me, I had to really reconcile, could I pull the trigger if it came to it? And if I did, how do I live with myself after that?
That's such an interesting way to look at it, Yasmin, because you're right. There's the legal justification, and he takes a few steps toward you brandishing a 30-centimetre knife. You have genuine fear for your life or the life of your partner, which basically, without going on to the minutiae, gives you the legal right to use fatal force against him. So there's that. But this case also highlights the huge number of incidences that police, both experienced and inexperienced, find themselves in. And tragically, often some of these top-end, high-level violent confrontations are committed by people who, at another time and another circumstance, you could be sitting down having a very rational discussion with them. It's a lose-lose, isn't it? Really, I guess, in many situations when we look at it like that.
It sure is. It is lose-lose. And I do look at those situations, particularly those that hit the media. There's a lot of criticism from armchair experts that the police should have done this, they should have done that. Why didn't they do that? Why didn't they just shoot to maim? And one of the really important things for the public to understand is we're not taught to maim. There's a really good chance you're going to miss, the limb that you're going for. We are taught to stop the threat, full stop. And that is a situation no person, no human being, and I say human being because police are human beings. They wear a uniform, but there is a person behind it, and that person has to wear many hats in their day. And I think, there's a really interesting conversation around perceptions of police and how they're judged, but conversation for another day. However, those are lose-lose situations for the people involved. Nobody wants anybody to lose their life or be injured at the end of the day. But we, have taken an oath to protect the public, to protect life and property. And if we don't do that, we can be held responsible personally. So it isn't a great situation to be in.
Also, coupled with that is the incredible inaccuracy of handguns.
Yes.
You would remember back at the academy the first time you picked up a gun and they get you about, what is it? It's probably not even 10 foot from that target and you shoot 6 rounds and you go up. How many are maybe one is in there and you're looking around, where are the other 5 rounds?
Oh my gosh. And it looks so close. You're like, yeah, I got this. I've watched
miss.
Bad Boys a few times. I'm all good. And no, it is actually really hard when you have to start to learn how to use the sight on a handgun. If you're left-handed or right-handed, depending on your stance, they teach you all of this stuff. But the thing is, in the police academy, you don't get a lot of opportunities to practice. You can't, bullets are expensive. So there's not a lot of opportunity to perfect your skills. And I think that's a really interesting misconception when it comes to the police, is all the training that you get or don't get and how applicable, I guess, it is to the real world scenarios that you're faced with. The police academy was amazing and I had a fantastic time and learnt and grew so much. But the real job and the real learning starts the day you graduate. And
the idea, and you mentioned it before, and we do hear this, Yasmin, well, why didn't the police just shoot him in the arm or shoot him in the leg? It's not like the TV shows.
Yeah.
From 10, 15 metres away, shooting at someone, as awful as it is, you go for that body mass. And even then, there's a chance you're going to miss.
There's a good chance you're going to miss.
To say, well, if you shot him in the wrist, he'd drop
the gun. Yeah.
Well, it's not John Wayne.
Yeah.
It's not.
It's not going to happen. I imagine some snipers would struggle with that, depending on how far away they are. It's not easy. And in that situation, you've got to take into account the pressure from all angles, the people around you, the members of the public. That's the other thing. When you think about shooting someone, you've got to think about crossfire. You've got to think about who's behind that person. Who are they holding? We're in situations where offenders will grab a child, and hold them in front of their central body mass. How are you going to deal with that situation? These are all of the considerations that might go through a police officer's head in a situation like that.
6 weeks in, this has got to be quite a light bulb moment for you, and it's not one that most experience 6 weeks in. Did it get you to question, Yasmin, your career choice? Did it get you to question yourself, personally, okay, is this for me? Could I have taken that next step if need be? Where did you go with that?
Yeah, definitely. There was a huge moment or moments of reflection. Firstly, it was, could I pull the trigger if I had to? Did I have a calm enough mind to assess the situation effectively and make a good, solid decision? And I think, rightly or wrongly, and this is a scary thing to learn about yourself, to be honest, I felt that if I was pushed, I would have done it. And that's a moment in of itself, if I was pushed, could I take a life to protect the public or myself or my partner? Yes, I could. And you do judge yourself in many ways. And did I question whether I wanted to be a police officer? No. You get caught up in many ways in the excitement of a job like that. It's exciting in ways, but, the seriousness of it, that side where we had to really decide, is this for me? It was an interesting sort of point of reflection where I believe that I could have done it and what came with that.
Yasmin, the comment that was made to you by your partner, senior constable, he's got about 10 years in the job, almost a bit of a shrugging of the shoulders, looking down his nose a bit sort of, and there's a bit of blokey carry on with that too, but that sort of apathy, did you find as you moved through the job and you experienced more things like that, did you find yourself becoming a little sort of harder in your thought process and things like that?
I think everybody becomes a little bit harder in the way that you think about things. It's a self-preservation technique, essentially. You're dealing with people on the worst day of their lives, in the worst situation of their lives every day of your week. But I guess it's something that should be considered a lot by police officers. I'm of the belief that way of thinking is a massive contributor to the rates of PTSD that we're seeing, the lack of access for mental health services, the lack of a willingness to admit when you're struggling or that something has affected you, that sort of shutdown moment where you have to take a can to harden up, that's the job, the response to that. I think in 2024, in today's day and age, it's not a very mature response. And I think, there's things that in my time I've tried to do better. I've tried to make sure that I've recognised if somebody was struggling. I've watched if I had colleagues that were having a hard time. I've asked the question, are you okay? It's important for us as police officers to make sure that we're looking after each other and not putting ego before our health. And that was maybe a catalyst moment, that first 6 weeks kind of being a bit shocked at that response. Maybe it made me do the opposite in terms of the way I addressed my colleagues then.
That's really interesting because you're right. You go back further and further at time in the job and the general consensus was you didn't complain, you didn't put your hand up, you just did what you had to do, and anything other than that was seen as weakness and that type of thing. And I say this with due respect. You said at times you felt like a bit of a square peg in a round hole, and you equated that to your personality, which is very open, very empathetic, coming up against a different type of personality.
Yeah, I think I probably wasn't meant to be in a paramilitary organisation in that context. My parents had probably attest to the fact that I was always a very outspoken, rebellious child, and that's always sort of gone with me. So the rules are meant to be bent or broken according to my life. I was a different kind of police officer. I didn't fit the mould. I, in many ways like to be really positive. I like to be a good communicator. I tried to be myself despite the fact that I was wearing a uniform that people would always make assumptions about me purely because I was wearing it. And while I think that was difficult early on, people made judgments about the fact that I looked a certain way or maybe I was, a bit airheaded. I had a colleague I remember early on who didn't know me when I first started at Newtown who called me a lava lamp. And I went, what do you mean, lava lamp? And she said, pretty to look at, but not much else going on, no other functions that are any good. So, you go through that and that's your sort of introduction to a police force that's meant to be about protection, but culturally it could be really different. And I think, for me, I'm gay, and I at that point in time didn't fit the mould, I guess, the public persona, if you will, of what the public would think a lesbian looked like. So they watch Mardi Gras and see dykes on bikes and think that is the category that I should be within, and I didn't fit that. And so there was a lot of challenging of, is she really gay? She just needs to be turned with the right man. I had off-the-cuff remarks happen like that, but I also had really serious situations that impacted my safety because of that attitude. I had a police sergeant that I worked with who made a move, obviously was rejected, and he wouldn't talk to me for about 6 or 8 weeks while we were on shift together, so wouldn't answer the police radio. So if we look at that situation that we've talked about earlier where we've got a person with mental ill health who is violent, and you've got a person who won't respond to your calls on the police radio, that places you in significant jeopardy. And so these are the situations where you don't fit the mould, when you aren't the normal sort of cookie-cutter police officer that sometimes you come up against, and you've got to find your way through that. You've got to find your allies and your advocates and really lean into your resilience and knowing who you are and what you stand for. But as a 23-year-old, I didn't know myself that well, and that confidence comes with time and maturity. So it was a growth area and period of time for sure.
Police force as always continues to be a very tough environment for women. I mean, you can't dress that up. It just is. The time that you went into the job, which is close to 20 years ago, far more men than women. Women were the minority on section and that type of thing. And we know, and I've had the privilege of having a lot of ex-serving police women on the other side of the desk, and they talk about this. It's a common theme through all of it. Interesting too, picking up there, Yasmin, it's dealing with other female police officers that can sometimes be perhaps equally as tough. Would that be a fair call?
Absolutely. I think, to build on your point about how difficult it is for women in the force, one of the ways that they succeed is to become like men. And in many ways, as much of a man as any other man in the police force, and to really go toe-to-toe and nose-to-nose with them. And so, yeah, you do come across women who are aggressively anti-feminist and who don't like the way that you look, or that think, that they'll make assumptions in ways that are, categorically untrue and judge you without getting to know you. So, one of the things that always does work in the job, though, is to become a good operator, and that's how you gain respect. And so over time, you pay attention, you get opportunities to show what you've got, how you can contribute, how you deal with an offender, how you write, a report, how you deal with a brief. Everything like that starts to come together, and your reputation, like it or lump it, begins to precede you. And so you can look like I do, or you can look like your typical dyke on a bike, whatever you want to be. Not that one is better than the other at all, but just in terms of assumptions that people might make about you based on physical appearance, your work will speak for you eventually.
2012, you moved to the Rosebay Command, a very wealthy Sydney suburb, one of the wealthier Sydney suburbs, sits on Sydney Harbour there. I'd imagine the assumption, perhaps both inside the police and otherwise, is a pretty cruisy command, easy environment to police. The reality for you was quite different.
Yeah, I think I grew up in the eastern suburbs, so I had a really good understanding of Rosebay and the types of people that lived there, and I guess when I started, the types of experiences that were very unexpected. So it's a very high socioeconomic area. People made the assumption both in the police force and external that rich people didn't really have problems, that they had these amazing super yachts that they went out on, and, maybe their worst part of their day was when their bag of Coke didn't turn up. But what I actually found was there was a significant amount of mental health in that command. Domestic violence obviously occurred, but it was quite different to what you might experience in other areas. So let's say Western Sydney and the volume of physical assaults that might happen there. We were dealing with financial domestic violence. We were dealing with emotional domestic violence, coercion, these sort of quite sophisticated ways of dealing with different people in those situations. But of course the physical was there too. I can recall, a job not so long before I finished up there where we had a recidivist victim, and we had a job in Paddington, and we turned up to this job and her throat had been slit. She was still alive. It obviously hadn't caught the jugular. But I remember this moment where we've sort of come up to her and started talking to her and asked who did it, and she told us that she did it to herself. Like, that was the level of protection that she wanted to afford her partner in that moment. And, it really speaks to the difficulties that police have in court processes as well when you're dealing with that sort of level of mental health and domestic violence that's going on. And that was happening in, the richest postcode in Australia. So it was seen as a cruisy command, and we went down to Bondi and, had a coffee with the lifeguards every now and then, but it really did have a dark underbelly as well once you were there for long enough.
It's interesting, that term coercive control, Yasmin, is one that we're getting more familiarity with, aren't we? And it's interesting to note that, when you work in areas, and I don't mean to generalise, but when you work in what are recognised as, say, tougher areas of Sydney, domestic violence is often in a physical context. It's possibly alcohol-fuelled and things such as that. You go into a different demographic, and it was interesting for you to use terms like financial and coercive control. And I would say, at the risk of generalising, but I think we can, overwhelmingly males who are coercively controlling their partners through finance, through all sorts of different means. And these are powerful people.
They really are. And they will be the first to turn around and say, don't you know who I am? I'm a barrister, I'm a lawyer. And it's really interesting because once you've been in the job long enough, you go, oh, what sort of lawyer are you? And they'll say, I'm an environmental lawyer. And so you just go, okay, well, your level of understanding or the posturing that you're putting on right now doesn't mean anything. And I'm working within the law and my rights and what I should be doing to protect the public. So you can call them on that. But yes, there was certainly powerful people controlling many parts of their family. So certainly their partners. But, I can remember some significant ones where we had men who were controlling their elderly mothers by withholding medication, to try and make sure that they died a little earlier so that they could receive an inheritance. All of that started to come into play, and we learnt about the spectrum of domestic violence, not just being physical abuse, but all of these other facets of abuse that you need to be on the lookout for, and how do you gather evidence around that. And, for officers in the command, we weren't really taught on any major level how to do that. You had your procedures for any investigation, and particularly when it comes to domestic violence, your statement taking, your ability to question and interview people was really important. But those sorts of crimes weren't common until you got to places like Rosebay, in my experience.
Interesting too, again, without perhaps trying to generalise, if you're working in a command in a tougher demographic, the sight of a police car pulling up out the front of the house, it doesn't attract. No one bats an eyelid. In fact, in some areas, if there's no police car in the street on a day or a couple of days, people are going, well, what's going on here? You go to somewhere like Rosebay, a police car pulls up outside one of those big Rosebay, and they are mansions, some of these homes, the homes of Kerry Packers and some of these other people. To see a police car in the street, to see police actually going to an address, this is something that many people in those environments haven't seen. Who's calling you to some of this? Because there would be a reluctance for even those on the receiving end. And oftentimes with domestic violence, police aren't getting called by the target of the violence, are they? So you're often getting called by neighbours, by children, by things like that. Can you just explain
definitely.
that?
So neighbours are an interesting one in an area like this because of their, perception and assumption to the rights and the way that they want to live. So, to speak of police cars turning up in streets, it's always interesting because you're going to deal with neighbours who will come up to you and demand to know why you're there. And this sort of presumption and expectation that they have a right to know the ins and outs of what's going on. This is their street. They own that land. This is my house.
They pay your wages.
Exactly. Oh, yes, they do. Oh, they pay our wages. It's something that you do learn in a command like Rosebay, that in many ways people like that are really easy to deal with when you know when you know the right things to say. When you're dealing with ego, you can manipulate people quite easily that way, and they don't really realise it. And they don't expect it from a lowly police officer either. And that's not to say, not that we manipulate people, but it's about knowing how to address people, whether they are a billionaire or they're a janitor in a school. You treat everybody equally, but you know what levers to pull when it comes to trying to make that situation work for you. And by that I mean make sure that everybody is safe, that we're getting the information that we need, that we're understanding the facts of what's actually occurred, and, creating a better outcome, basically, because we're there. They do call the neighbours, the kids will call. We have had, speaking of kids, I worked a lot as a youth liaison officer and, dealing with a lot of kids who were very violent and families who were really reluctant to call because they didn't want to compromise their child's futures, thinking that they were going to get, charged with offences and taken to court and getting a criminal record. So this reluctance to involve police by many facets of that community, you had to really earn their trust first before they would give you a call and tell you what was really going on.
Yasmin, you mentioned high levels of mental health issues. I'm just interested in a snapshot of the typical type of mental health issues that a frontline police officer in Rosebay would be dealing with.
It could be everything. It could be anxiety, depression. It can be drug overdoses, that have happened sometimes. Partners or kids or family will say that they've done it for attention and that there isn't actually mental illness, and you're dealing with that scenario. Where I was probably called most and spent the most of my time, as probably every other officer at Rosebay would attest to, is a location called The Gap, which for any non-Sydney listeners, that's a 96-metre high cliff top in Watson's Bay and it is one of the most famous suicide hotspots in the world. So if you were to Google the Gap, typically it comes up in the first page or the first 10 search results of the best ways to kill yourself. And so as an officer there, particularly at certain parts or times of the year, we'd be there sometimes several times a week, sometimes several times a shift to deal with people who were wanting to end their life. And that was, a lesson in of itself. We, again, in the police academy, got a bit of training on how to speak to people in these situations and circumstances. But really, when you are on a cliff top with someone, trying to understand why they're there and, wondering if the next thing you say might not be the right thing or might make things worse and cause them to jump, that's a pressure and an experience that nothing can really prepare you for. And so you have to go really within yourself. And I talk a lot about that human element of policing because that's what you are relied upon to give. You are talking person to person. You metaphorically take your uniform off and you're there trying to understand how you can help a person in crisis. And sometimes, they might have schizophrenia, they're hearing voices, and there's nothing that you can do about that other than try to get them to listen to you over the voice that tells them to jump off that cliff.
Just on that, Yasmin, 2014, you'd been at the Rosebay Command for a couple of years, and as you say, no doubt numerous visits to the Gap in that role. There was a case, though, in 2014, you got a call in the morning that there was someone at the Gap. Can you walk us through this case?
Sure. This incident changed my life. It was really one of those moments that just set me on a different path. So we had a job come in, lights and sirens down to the Gap, and we got out of the car, walked up the stairs to Gap Bluff, and we were confronted not with an adult, but with a 14-year-old girl who was over the incorrect side of the fence up at the Gap over a cyberbullying incident. Now, back in that year, I knew about social media, I knew about Facebook, and I'd heard of Instagram. But this was a situation that really woke me up to the power of social media and the online world for young people. So I spoke to this girl and asked her what had happened and tried to get out of her, what caused her to come to this point. And she said that someone had taken a picture of her in class without her knowledge and had uploaded it to Instagram, where people who she thought were her friends and then other random strangers critiqued how she looked, told her that she had a terrible face, that she was fat and ugly. And then at the end of this message thread, someone said, "Why don't you drink bleach and kill yourself?" Now, she obviously didn't choose that method, but it did take her to a cliff's edge within moments of stepping off it. And in that moment, I didn't really know what to say to that. I had no experience in the online world and didn't really know about social media. And so I just had to keep talking to her about the reasons that she had to keep going, to really empathize and validate her feelings, despite the fact that I couldn't agree with them. But I've since learnt, obviously, the right way to deal with people is to validate where they're at. And this particular conversation, it was a long one. This one took hours to get her over the correct side of the fence, which we did in the end. But it wasn't just me as well. It was Polair in the sky. It was Marine Area Command waiting in the water for when she went off. And those moments, that's never left me. And that really did make me realise the power of the online world for kids and for us as adults, how much we need to do better in understanding how to help them manage the risks that it poses for them. And so at that point in time, I was doing a little bit of work as a youth liaison officer in the command, and part of my job was to go to schools and to educate kids and students on a range of different things. And at that point in time, I had a slide deck with the Telecommunications Criminal Code Act on it, where I was meant to turn up and tell kids that if you shared a nude image or you were mean to someone online, you were going to be arrested and go to jail for 12 years. It was ridiculous. And they could see right through it as well. And so for me, I like to be effective in the things that I do. So I changed the way that we delivered that information. I did it without permission, as per my, childhood tendencies to not listen and, not abide by the rules. But, I wanted to start making a difference in kids' lives in this area. And so I guess, it set me on a different trajectory. As part of that as well, we created a youth-based film festival, which was inspired by those events, which was really a purposeful event where we got kids to use mobile phones as a tool for good, of empowerment, of storytelling, rather than a tool to bully each other. And so we created this amazing film festival about a year later where kids in their thousands participated and created short stories on their mobile phones about their experiences in the online world and what they wanted the adults around them to do.
And the crux of that, tragically, was this young girl, goodness me, 14, year 9, who's standing on the edge of the gap for several hours, could have ended, obviously, tragically. I'm really interested in exploring some of the work that you've done as a result of that moving forward. Could I just take half a step back? When that young girl steps over the other side of the fence and she's back there with you and, you know, you embrace her or somebody does and she's now safe, what happens there? What's the police involvement? Because there's a real conundrum, isn't there, with the work that you do with those people and how draining, exhausting it must be, and you get them back over there, and then it's sort of like there's almost nothing.
Yeah. It's an ongoing battle, and I really hope, you know, in my time since I've been in the police that this has improved. But in my time, we had so many instances, countless, where we would talk people back, we would schedule them, which means that, you know, we take them against their will a lot of the time to the police, to the hospital, I should say, where they are to see a psychiatrist, a doctor, and they may or may not be admitted. And in many cases, unless you stay with them as a police officer, they will not voluntarily stay there. They don't want to be scheduled. They don't want to go into a clinic a lot of the time. And so we would have situations where on the same shift, we would schedule someone in the morning, we would take them to the hospital, we would have to leave because we only had a couple of trucks on a shift and we'd have to get back to our area. And we'd find that same person back at the Gap in the afternoon because the hospital had released them. And I remember we had quite a few arguments with the NUMs in the emergency departments and the security officers because somebody had to babysit this person until they could be seen, you know, and if they were triaged and they weren't triaged as, you know, a person that was going to cause themselves immediate harm if they were sitting with a police officer in, you know, a hospital, which is highly likely it's going to be under control, then they're often left. And so we have to sit there, limited resources in the police force, and make sure that they stay and actually receive the treatment that they need, or we leave and risk that they will go off and hurt themselves, that they'll go through with what we just intervened in, or that we'd have to deal with them again 6 hours later.
And respectfully, you know, the skill that it takes to talk somebody back from an edge like that is a skill, there is no doubt. But when you're there sitting with them at the closest hospital, what is Prince of Wales or wherever it may be,
St Vincent and Prince of Wales, yeah.
You're sitting alongside this person. You're not a suicide counsellor. You're not a psychologist. But you're sort of almost having to play that pseudo role with them as you're looking at your watch, going, well, it seems very inadequate, that process for mine. Has it improved to your knowledge?
Look, not to my knowledge. I believe that, you know, police are still in situations where, I mean, hospitals are in the same boat, right? There's no resources there. There's limited funding and it goes in a variety of different areas, certainly not to security guards or people who have the opportunity to sit and do nothing but, you know, hang out with a patient. So, no, I don't believe it has improved. There was, you know, a memorandum of understanding that was being negotiated around the time that I left. I hope that it has improved because we need police to be on the job. We need them to be out there protecting the public rather than, you know, sitting in a hospital ward with a patient. While that's incredibly important and that person needs support and care, it's not the job of police to do that.
So, Yasmin, that tragic case, as you said, I don't think I'm overstating it, it changed your life. It changed the course of your career in the police, and even perhaps we could argue led to a springboard from leaving the police and the work that you still do. You mentioned that part of what you did was, through your youth aid work, was bring these young people together. And the term, I think, pocket filmmaking, is that? Can you explain that?
Yeah, pocket filmmaking. So what we tried to do, given that this, situation that happened with the girl at the Gap was caused by a cyberbullying incident, the centre of that was a mobile phone. We were really trying to be creative about the way that we could ensure that young people's voices were heard in an accessible way and to utilise a tool like the mobile phone for good. And so we created this film festival where kids could tell their stories about their experiences, both good and bad, to the adults in their lives. The film festival was called Realise, and it's still going today, whatever it is, 15 years later, 10, 14, my maths is terrible, whatever it was. But, it was a powerful moment. And in that time, what we knew that we needed to attract kids, and adults alike to this festival was to have an ambassador. And I had watched a celebrity called Charlotte Dawson for a while experience some pretty significant online trolling. I'd read the media and seen the reports. And so I approached her and asked her if she would be our ambassador. And, like the amazing woman that she was, she didn't even blink an eye, didn't hesitate, and said, yes, absolutely. And so I got to know her over the time that we ran Realise in the first couple of years. And she was an amazing woman, obviously no longer with us. Also a situation where she took her own life, but a significant part of her experience was, negative online behaviour directed towards her by members of the public. And so as part of Realise and getting to know her, I started to work with her a little more around her experiences. And I guess it was another moment, another layer of exposure to this world and the impact that it has on everyday human beings. When I was talking to Charlotte, we'd meet and have a goslomy down at Double Bay markets, and she'd talk to me about how people would send her pictures of dead babies on Twitter, and how could she get rid of that. And I'd learnt a little bit more about it, obviously subsequent to this experience. And, we tried to put in reports. We didn't know much about the e-safety commissioner at that time, and it would take days for Twitter to remove posts like that from her feed, let alone, mean and nasty comments or people that had trolled her. And it was a really tricky scenario from a human perspective, because Charlotte was a really strong woman and really fierce advocate and did not want to back down to trolls. Now, the advice that we would often give someone in those scenarios is to not respond, is to block, report, restrict, whatever it might be. But Charlotte wouldn't do that. And on one hand, I totally respect and admire her fight. But on the other hand, all it did was encourage more and more trolls and pile-ons in her life. And, we had situations where she had my personal number, so she'd call me in the middle of the night and, just want to talk about what had gone on. And she was quite emotional and upset about it, as would anyone be. And it's certainly, not the reason that she's no longer here, but certainly a contributor to her mental health at that time, and another example that we can't let this sort of behaviour go on.
Your connection with Charlotte Dawson, both in a professional level and a personal level, was such that I understand that with her tragic death, taking her own life, it becomes a coroner's case, and you, I think, submitted a report to the coroner.
I thought the right thing to do, I went and saw the OIC, who was at King's Cross, which is the area that Charlotte had lived, and I asked if it would be okay if I submitted a report and just detailed, I guess, her experiences and the people that we had tried to, I guess, investigate, tried to bring some charges against. We didn't end up being successful in that because it was really difficult to identify beyond a reasonable doubt that this person who wrote this comment was the person sitting behind the screen at the time. But I thought it was really important that that was included, at least for a consideration for the coroner.
Yasmin, you're 10 years on from the incident at the Gap, and it was that incident, as tragic as it was, but not as tragic as it may have been had it not been for your intervention, which took you on that different pathway through the police, which has now led to you, leaving the police of your own volition and going down that path with, as you've just described, the company that you're now running. That young girl, she'd be 24 now. Do you ever wonder where she is, how she got on? Do you know?
I don't know, but I wonder often. I have faith that she's okay. I mean, when we got her off that cliff, it's obviously a very high intensity situation. Did I feel like she would return? Something in my gut said she would be okay. Those situations as well, what brought her to that moment was obviously a cyberbullying incident, a terrible thing that happened. It's certainly not the only thing that was going on in her life. So that's one of the things we've got to remember. There's always elements that contribute to a person ending up in that particular situation. But sometimes it takes that to change your life. It takes that to really recognise where you want to go. She struck me as a girl that was going to be okay. She had an amazing support system, a lovely and wonderful family. Do I wonder where she is? Yes. I hope that she's okay. I really feel like she is. And I'm really grateful to have played a role in making sure that that day wasn't her last.
Yasmin, I want to thank you so much for coming in to the studio to have a chat to us today. 13 years of service to the good people in New South Wales, and thank you so much for your service. And thank you for the work that you continue to do in that area that is that much, much needed area with regards to understanding, dealing with and trying to reduce cyberbullying. And because this is a world that your two young children are growing up in, mine have grown up in, and we just cannot do enough in that space. And to have got there on the back of the work that you did in the police is just such a wonderful story, and thank you so much for sharing it with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Crime Insiders Detectives is a LiSTNR original production. It's hosted by me, Brent Sanders, produced by Ed Gooden, and sound designed and imaged by Link Kelly. If this content affects you, the number for Lifeline is 13 11 14.